Hello, my name is Murray Fulton. I'm a professor in the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm also affiliated with the Center for the Study of Cooperatives, which itself is an affiliate of the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School. At the center, I hold the Cooperative Retailing Chair in Cooperative Governance. The purpose of this lecture is to examine what I call the world's simplest cooperative. Now, cooperation as a sort of activity has been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's kind of an integral part of what we as humans have done over time. The formal organization known as a cooperative has a much, much shorter life, really dating back to roughly 150 to 200 years ago. What I want to do in this lecture is describe the differences between the cooperative organization and what is probably the most common organization, what I'm going to call the investor-owned firm. These investors make that investment with the idea of making a return on that investment. And what we want to do is look at the kind of behavior that the investor-owned firm exhibits and what the outcome is of that behavior. And then we want to compare that behavior and that outcome to that of a cooperative. And to do that, we're going to really simplify. We're going to strip away all the kind of extra details and focus on just the key aspects of both an investor-owned firm and a cooperative. So what are some of those key features? Let's start with that. Well, the starting point is that both of these organizational types are businesses. They are operating to provide goods and services to groups of people, to individuals. We can call them consumers. They do so at some kind of a price. Where we get a difference between these two types of organizations is in the type of behavior that they exhibit, the way that they do these two activities. So almost every activity in the world could be undertaken by a cooperative. I'm going to give you three examples. A common example around the world is a group of people getting together to supply themselves with some consumer product. A common one is fuel, but it could also be groceries, could be sporting goods, outdoor recreational goods. And the idea there is that it's the people that are using those services, that are buying the fuel, that are also owning the business that then produces or supplies that good or that service. So that's one example. A second example is, one can think about this as a service. Consider dairy farmers, for instance. They produce milk, but to really get the value for that milk, they need that milk to be transformed into some other product, be it cheese, be it butter, yogurt, what have you. A third example of an activity that's undertaken by a cooperative is a daycare. Here, the individuals that are purchasing the service or using the service are parents. They are looking for services for their children, daycare services for their children. And they hire staff, they invest in buildings, equipment to undertake that particular activity. Now, of course, all those three same activities could be undertaken by an investor-owned firm, where a group of investors decided to put some money together, invest it with the idea of providing that service to a group of consumers, and in the hopes that they're going to be able to earn a rate of return. And usually that rate of return is measured in terms of profits. And that's what we're going to look at today. Is we're going to assume that the investor-owned firm is interested in trying to earn as much profit as possible from their activity. That's the similarity between these two types of organizations, is that they both provide goods and services to a group of people. But you've also, I think, seen as I've gone through these examples that there are some differences between these two organizations. And the key difference is who is making the decision about the provision of this good or service. In the one case, it's a set of investors. In the other case, it's the people who are actually buying the good or service. And as we're going to see, and this is really what I want to concentrate for the rest of this lecture, is that this difference in this difference in the starting point has a real impact on the ultimate behavior of these organizations, and then on the way that the outcome is, or the distribution of that outcome on the various groups in this little kind of economy that we're going to think about. So let's get started with this little exercise. As I said, I'm going to strip away all the all the unnecessary details and take a look at what I call the world's simplest co-op. I want you to think about two parallel universes. These two universes are absolutely identical in every way, shape, and form, except that in one universe, there's an investor-owned firm that's going to provide a good or a service to a group of individuals. In the other, it's going to be the individuals themselves that are going to provide the good or service. And then what we're going to do is compare the outcomes of these two universes to see what the impact is of a cooperative versus an investor-owned firm. We're going to make the assumption that there's only one firm that's providing the good or service. So it's either going to be a co-op or it's going to be an IOF, depending upon which universe you're in. In each of these universes, there are n individuals. These individuals are all identical, okay? And these individuals have the opportunity to buy a good or service. If they are able to purchase that service, they get a benefit from that good or that service. And we're going to designate that benefit as B. And B is some number. So you can think about it as 100 units of benefit. So it's some kind of measure of the benefit that consumers get from having access to that good or service. So that benefit, if you go back to our examples, that benefit is the benefit to consumers, for instance, of being able to purchase gasoline or groceries. The benefit to farmers of having some processing done of their agricultural product, or the benefit to parents of having daycare services. Okay, so that's the benefit. Now, the individuals have to pay for access to that benefit. And we're going to assume that the access price is denoted as P. And just very simply, we're going to take B minus P as the net benefit to each individual. If a consumer got a benefit of 100 from having access to the service and it cost them 50, they would get a net benefit of 50. Okay? That's the benefit. Now, we're also going to assume that unless that net benefit is 0 or greater, consumers won't buy that product or that service at all. They'll simply take their money and use it elsewhere. Okay? So there has to be a net benefit that is either 0 or positive in order for consumers to actually buy this good or service. And this is an important feature of the problem. We're going to assume that there are some costs associated with producing this particular good or service. So there's two costs that we have to worry about. One is kind of an operating cost, or what economists call a marginal cost. And we're going to just assume that that's 0. This doesn't really change the answer in any measurable way, and it just makes the calculations much, much easier. But the other cost, the fixed cost associated with supplying the good, we do have to assume that there's something there. So here, it might be the cost, for instance, of building a whole network of gasoline stations if you're supplying gasoline. Or it might be the cost of having the equipment necessary for a daycare to operate. That's the fixed cost. So those are the basic assumptions. What I want to do now is to think about what would investors do in the investor-owned firm, and what would the individuals that have formed the co-ops do if they had control of the cooperative. Okay? So let's start with the investor-owned firm. The investors in this firm would like to earn as much profit as possible, as we discussed earlier. So how do they do that? Well, they have to take a look at what their revenue is and subtract off the costs. Now their costs are F, the fixed costs. Their revenue would be how many units can they sell and at what price, what access price can they charge. And we'd have to take them the product of those two things. So number of units sold times the price. Well, we've assumed that all the individuals are identical. So if one person buys the good, then everybody's going to buy the good. So we either have nobody buying the good or everybody buying the good. Okay? Either all N people are buying it or nobody's buying it. What price do we need that would ensure everybody buys the good and that also maximizes profits for the IOF, or the investor-owned firm? Well, the answer is that we want to set the access price very, very, very close to B, if not equal to B. It's easy to see this. If you set it below B, then you could always raise it a little bit and earn more revenue, because N times P is your revenue for the firm. And if you can increase P a little bit, you're going to get more revenue, as long as you can keep N as N and it doesn't go to 0. And the way to make sure that you get all N individuals buying the good is to make sure that they get a net benefit. So you have to keep B minus P at least positive or equal to 0. So the idea is you push that access price all the way up to the point where it's just equal, or just very, very slightly under B. And for the purposes of this analysis, we're going to assume that, in fact, the investor-owned firm pushes it all the way up to B, which means that they then get a revenue of N times B. Now, just think about what happened if they increased that access price just a little bit more than B. Well, at this point, then, the consumers would find, or the individuals that are buying this good would find that their net benefit is negative, and they wouldn't buy the good at all. And in this case, the revenues of the investor-owned firm would fall to 0, and they wouldn't be earning any profit anymore. So, in fact, they would be making a loss of minus F. So the way the access price that we would expect the investor-owned firm to charge would be B. And with an access price of B, the net benefit to the individual is 0. The net benefit to all the individuals, if we just sum up the net benefit to each individual across all individuals, would be 0, because N times 0 is 0. And the profits to the investor-owned firm would be N times B minus F. And we're going to assume that N times B minus F is in fact positive, so that in fact it makes sense for this good to be supplied in the first place. Okay? So that's the behavior of the investor-owned firm, and we also see what the consequences of that are. In this case, the individuals that are actually buying the good and service don't see much benefit in the end to the good or service that they're getting, and the benefit goes to the investors in terms of profits. Now let's take a look at the co-op. What would we expect it to do? Well, here the co-op is not owned by investors, or maybe a slightly different way to put this is that it is owned by investors, but the investors in this case are also the individuals that buy the good. So these owners of the co-op are in fact both owners and users at the same time. If we want to think about this, they wear two hats. Okay? What would they like to do? What would their objective be in this decision-making process? So over in this parallel universe where the co-op is operating, what kind of calculation and strategy are they thinking about? Well, for the co-op members, and we can call them that because they are now the people that have formed this co-op, and so they've become members of this co-op, they want an access price that is as small as they can get while still making sure that the good gets supplied. And that price is F divided by N. So you take the fixed cost, whatever that is, and divide it by the number of individuals, and each individual pays that amount. They pay, if you like, their share of the fixed cost, where that fixed cost is divided equally across all individuals. And dividing that cost across all individuals kind of makes sense because in this world we got all our individuals being identical, and so splitting the costs evenly certainly makes sense. The net benefit in this case to an individual then would be B minus F over N. And that number, that expression, as we will soon see, is in fact greater than 0. And that follows from the fact that N times B minus F is greater than 0. And we know that that's true because if we want to take the net benefit to all individuals, which is just that net benefit to a single individual multiplied by N, which is the total number of individuals, we get NB minus F. And we know that that expression is positive. Okay? So in this case, the members of the co-op have an advantage to supplying themselves with the particular good, and they get a net benefit of B minus F over N. The one thing we haven't talked about yet is what the profits of this cooperative would be. In this case, the cooperative just breaks even in supplying the good to its members. It gets revenue of F because it's charging an access price of F over N, and it multiplies that by the number of members, which is N, and it gets a revenue of F. And its costs are F, so if you take F minus F, you get 0. So the co-op, as a business, just breaks even. The benefits in this case go to the individuals, to the individual members. And if we compare these two cases now, the investor-owned firm versus the co-op, we can see this clear distinction between these two organizational forms. We can see this distinction both in terms of the behavior, which is the kind of price that is charged by these two organizations, as well as in the outcome that occurs as a result of this different behavior. So the access price is different. In the one case, the investor-owned firm charges an access price of B. In the other case, in the co-op case, the access price is less than that, and it's F over N. In the case of the investor-owned firm, there are no benefits to the individual. In the case of the co-op, the benefits, in fact, flow to the individual. In the case of the investor-owned firm, the returns flow instead not to the people that are using the good, but to the investors, whereas in the co-op, well, we can say that it flows to the investors if we also recognize that, in fact, the members are the investors themselves. But really, what we typically do is we think that it flows to the individuals as individuals who were consuming that particular good, that they were simply investors so that they could get a benefit from using that particular good. So that's this clear distinction between a co-op and an investor-owned firm. And as I said at the beginning, this is the world's simplest co-op. I have stripped away everything that I can while still keeping the problem intact. Now, there are many, many things that need to be added in if you want to make this kind of more realistic in terms of what's going on in the real world. We would like to look at some kind of competition, either between investor-owned firms themselves, between co-ops, or between investor-owned firms and cooperatives. We would like to take a look at what happens if the individuals out in these two parallel universes are not identical, but are heterogeneous in some way. They have different incomes, they're different ages, they have different capacities, different tastes for goods and services. There's a whole variety of aspects in which these people might differ. And that's an important element. We need to take a look at the internal operation of both of these organizations. We have assumed in this analysis that the investors want the highest profits, and that's in fact the decision that is made by the investor-owned firm. Or if the members want the lowest price, that's the decision that the co-op makes. But in both of these organizations, typically, it's not the investors or the members that are themselves making the decision about what price to set. That decision is often turned over to a manager. And in fact, the manager reports not to the members themselves, at least in many co-ops, but rather to a board of directors that the members have elected. And so if one wanted to take a look at a more realistic situation, one would need to go in and examine that organizational structure and see what's happening internally, and how does that message from what say the investors wants, what they want, gets translated to what the board of directors wants, and how does that translate into the actions of the CEO, and then subsequently down into the management in the organization that's actually making the decisions. And similarly for the co-op, we would want to understand this relationship between the cooperative members, the board that they've appointed, the relationship between the board and the CEO, and then the relationship between the CEO and the employees within that within the co-op. And there are many, many other issues that one could explore. One of the important issues is, where does the financing come for the cooperative? So we need to think about what the incentives are for people to actually put capital into both of these organizations. And in fact, there's a great deal of literature in the cooperative area that looks at the financing procedures. How do you provide the right kinds of incentives and systems so that members have a willingness to actually put money into this to finance the operation of the organization. What's interesting about this world's simplest co-op is that this distinction that comes out so clearly, so sort of black and white, between the behavior and then the outcomes of these two organizations, tends to remain even as we add in all these additional elements. This distinction still remains the kind of the fundamental essence of the relationship between these two types of organizations. It's for that reason that the study of the world's simplest co-op, I think, is useful. One thing before we wrap up, I've talked about this sort of as we've been going along, but I haven't been explicit about it, and I think it's now sort of time to just put a slightly different lens on this same problem that we've just examined. What we've really been talking about here between these two organizational forms are two, to use kind of the terminology that's being used today, is we have two different governance structures. And in the one governance structure, in that of the IOF, we have a particular set of decision makers, the investors. In the co-op, we have a different set of decision makers, namely the members. And this, in fact, is at the essence of what governance is all about. One of the definitions of governance that I like is who gets to decide what. The what here we've simplified. It's the price, okay? It's the access price that the co-op or the IOF is charging. The who that gets to decide that is what changes between these two organizations. And we can see here that, if you like, governance matters. Who gets to decide actually matters for the behavior of the organization and the outcomes. And this is why people are interested in governance today. And they're interested in this question, who gets to decide what? Because this decision, as we can see in this little example, often has a real impact. Who gets to decide changes behavior, and that behavior then has different outcomes. Thank you very much.